Welcome in, everybody, to the Authority Podcast here on the B Podcast Network. Thanks, as always, for being with us. If you are a repeat listener, if you're a new listener, thanks for joining. We really hope to bring you a great conversation here. This episode is part of the National Literacy Month campaign that we are doing in partnership between the B Podcast Network and Reading is Fundamental, where we are hosting a number of productive conversations across our network of podcasts about developing kids' reading and literacy skills, their love of reading, and these skills and how it's going to serve them across the course of their lives. So my guests today are Kourtney Hake and Paige Timmerman. Kourtney has been teaching English at various levels since 2014. She currently works at Sparta Lincoln School in Sparta, Illinois, and teaches 8th grade English language arts, but she has taught all levels of high school as well as first-year writing at the college level. Paige has been teaching high school English since 2012, and she currently works at Salem Community High School in Salem, Illinois. She teaches all levels of 12th grade English, plus including an honors level dual credit writing course. She has also taught freshman and junior English. Their book is called Their Stories, Their Voices, Using Personal Narrative to Empower Student Writers, grades 6 through 12. Kourtney and Paige, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
I'd love to start, and you can each kind of give me thoughts on this, but we'll start with Paige and then Kourtney can add to it. What's the big idea of this book?
I would say our main purpose for writing was that we, as upper level ELA teachers, have noticed that there isn't a lot of material out there to help older students share their own stories. A lot of the writing materials for teachers of upper level grades focuses on analytical writing and test prep writing, but we felt like there was a need for our students to still engage in that narrative writing that you see so prevalently in the lower elementary grades, and it tends to disappear. And so Their Stories, Their Voices is sort of our effort to push narrative back with older writers.
Yeah, and with that, we were kind of seeing that, especially in the research for this book, the actual writing that you see being published has a lot of narrative in it. And yet we're not telling our students that they can include their own voices whenever they're writing. And so we wanted to actually have our students' writing reflect what they're actually going to be doing in the real world.
Yeah, and so the personal narrative is really at the core of this book. Can you define that for us when you're writing about the personal narrative? Kind of, Kourtney, maybe just give us a definition so that we have that context.
So we kind of defined it as sharing your story using your story for some clearly defined purpose, sharing somebody's own experience for a clearly defined purpose. And we kind of broke that down into different categories, like you would normally see in a writing classroom, where there is that analytical writing, there is that persuasive writing, but you can also incorporate narrative into that, incorporate your own story.
Got it. And what got each of you interested in personal narrative? I think you each had a little bit of a path toward this type of writing, and what interested you. Paige, and then Kourtney, you can tell us from each of your perspectives.
Yeah, that's actually in the first chapter of our book, because we each sort of had our own reasons for wanting to go down this research rabbit hole. And for me, I've always wanted to give my students opportunities to do assignments that feel real to them. So especially with senior level English, they have this desire of wanting to do activities in class that is actually going to help them in the next stages. And so when I looked around everything that I was reading and my daily life, we use our own stories constantly. Whenever we read anything online, there's usually some sort of personal narrative component where the writer is explaining their own experience. And then we tell our own experiences all the time to each other. And so if I wanted to create that authentic experience for my students where they are building skills that they will need in the next steps, then I feel like I definitely would be doing them a disservice if I didn't incorporate personal narrative writing.
And Kourtney, how about you?
So a lot of it came from Paige to begin with, but then whenever she first approached me about the idea, I was seeing narrative in everything as well. And it was kind of funny because my curriculum at the time as an 8th-grade teacher does not include narrative writing, except if I get to the very last unit. And then the type of narrative writing is not kind of what we generally think of as narrative. But then when my 8th-graders would take their state test, they were always asked to write a narrative. And so they were being asked to use their skills that they hadn't been working on throughout the entire school year. And they were really struggling with it. And so I was looking for ways to kind of incorporate that more into the entire school year rather than just a small little unit at the end.
Yeah.
And to add to that, Kourtney, I feel like in the book you talk about personal narrative and how it's helped you in your own life. Like she discusses her own experience with journaling and how that's been like a therapeutic activity for her to process things that have happened in life, and how she would like to share that experience with her students.
Yeah. Do you, as I referenced in the intro, we have this campaign going on all around literacy during National Literacy Month, and from the writing perspective, it seems to me that there's a great opportunity when students are engaged in understanding how to express personal narrative for it to have a positive impact on their their engagement with their reading and understanding how that same type of narrative writing is being put into place by a writer, whether it be their peers in class or an essay or a book or whatever they're writing, to kind of maybe have that better connection and understanding of the writer's perspective from on the reading skills point of view. Is that something that you have found, or have you found other ways that this, I guess, contributes to the development of other literacy skills beyond just the specifics of the writing, Kourtney?
I mean, our focus in this one was really on the writing itself, but we did use a lot of mentor texts that we kind of used throughout our research, and we tried to find mentor texts that were within the last 5 to 10 years, and that were telling a story for a specific purpose. And those texts are ones that we found that were a lot more engaging. And so the more that students are interested in the actual text themselves, they were able to translate that into their writing as well.
Paige, what are your thoughts on finding applicable mentor texts that are going to work well for students?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with what Kourtney was saying. And to add on to that, through our exploration, so we try to find great examples of each style of narrative that we were looking for, and it led us to these wonderful stories that we probably wouldn't have gotten to had we not gone down this research process. And one of the things we found during that process was that text doesn't have to be a written prose narrative or prose memoir like we think of when we think of narrative. We found tons of different like multimodal types of texts. So our book contains projects that include like drawing and using digital literacies and different kinds of text. And so I think that's kind of expanding the definition of what it means to be a reader.
Yeah. Excellent. So once teachers are committing to prioritizing personal narrative in their classrooms, in their curriculum, are there certain beliefs around being able to sustain that commitment, but also ensuring that it really works for students, and particularly the diversity of student perspectives and experiences that, of course, we want to encourage them to be able to open up and express themselves personally, but knowing that everybody has different experience, that we can't expect everyone to engage with it exactly the same way, or that it needs to be personalized, right, in order for the teaching to happen. So I'm wondering, are there certain beliefs around that from the teacher that say, okay, this is what we have to anticipate, this is what we have to expect, this is what we have, this is the environment that we have to provide. Paige, I'll let you start with that, and then Kourtney.
Yeah. It's funny that you asked that question, because I think we have a section in chapter 1 that goes through, here are our core beliefs that we have as teachers that are informing these units of instruction that we're doing. And one of them is being able to be very open to allowing your students to go through whatever writing process they need to go through. So we're really big on the writer's workshop. We spend a whole chapter talking about the writer's workshop, which, for those that are not familiar, it is where teachers do a lot of checking in with students and kind of support them in the process, rather than just handing them a grocery list of things they want to write. So for those that are unfamiliar, we guide them through that. We also talk about how SEL, social emotional learning, is something that really needs to be at the forefront if you're going to really hear and respect what students have to say about their lives. That has to be a strong component in your instruction. I know there are others. Kourtney, do you remember any of the others that we talked about in chapter 1?
Yeah, so we did have insensitive to student trauma, which includes kind of SEL, allowing all voices to be heard. But one of the main components that we talked about a lot, especially while we were in the early process, is allowing the material within the book to be adaptable to all situations. Because Paige has a ton of freedom in her classroom. She's basically told, here's the standards, you do whatever you want with that. Whereas at my school, for the most part, we're given a curriculum and it's day 1, you do this, day 2, you do this. And I have some freedom with that, but it's more of kind of supplementing with these ideas rather than I'm doing whatever I want to. And so a lot of it is kind of adaptable to that situation as well.
And so what are some of the different types of narratives that students may write?
So the latter half of our book is broken down. Each chapter is for a different type of narrative. So the first one is called the informative narrative. So your purpose ultimately is to inform an audience, but you're pulling in narrative in order to do that. Because sometimes our students are experts on something. They may not think they are, but oftentimes they are about something. It may be like the best jeans to wear to go through a day of school, or it may be which tire to buy for their truck. And so getting narrative involved in informing an audience kind of helps establish your expertise. It shows your audience, hey, I know what I'm talking about because I've been through this experience. So we have a whole chapter full of different projects where students can use their own experiences to inform or try to teach or help their audience. So that's the first type. The second type is called the analytical narrative. So this one is where the writer is sort of like exploring a question. They're not necessarily trying to find a concrete answer. It's usually like very open-ended questions that they're exploring, but they're kind of documenting their progress of like what they're learning along the way. And so that is a chapter where we have a lot of multimodal projects, because the podcast is kind of a good example of a medium where you're exploring a question and you're kind of grappling with it and talking about what you're learning along the way. So that chapter is all about different ways to do that. I can turn it over to Kourtney. Kourtney, do you want to do the other two?
Sure. So our next one is the persuasive narrative, which people will write persuasive essays, but it's by incorporating narrative into it, you're kind of bringing in the more personal side of it. There's a lot of times where we'll read something that we don't necessarily care about a topic until we hear about one person's story with it. And that gives them a chance to have something that they care about, but they can actually kind of try and fight for change with it. And our final one was the reflective narrative, which is kind of the more typical narrative that you think of. You're reflecting on some kind of experience or some kind of information and telling your story about it.
Are there particular things that, I guess, correspond more with different types of narratives that students are needing to focus on the most regarding, even though it's personal narratives, are there certain ones that include more reliance on other sources, or others that, like, what are some of the ways, I guess, that students are developing different skill sets as they're thinking about the different types of narratives, even though they're all related? Kourtney can start, and then Paige.
Yeah, so we actually have a menu that we start each chapter with, where you start with the skills that you want to teach for that unit, and we give a list of a certain number of them. And then you choose a project that will help develop those skills. And then you choose a starter project that kind of leads to that, kind of a backwards planning, where you start with what you want to end with in mind, and then you go back and kind of figure out how to get there. So we do have those kind of skills, or craft moves is what we call them, in every chapter, that kind of focus more on that type of narrative, but they're easily applicable to all different types of narrative, depending on how you're wanting to use them.
Do you recommend any type of a sequence to students working on these, practicing them? I like, for example, obviously, to write persuasively, it doesn't technically require any analytical skills, or even technically any facts at all. However, it might be a priority to say, look, if you can really do a clear analysis of a particular issue that you can then communicate to somebody, and then there's a certain conclusion that you want to persuade them of, that could support that, and that would be helpful in certain types of writing. Again, you don't have to necessarily try to persuade somebody after you've done an analysis, but those things could work together nicely. Same with informative. Does it matter if there's a sequence? Is there a place that you would at least recommend starting, Paige?
Well, I mean, our book doesn't necessarily recommend a specific sequence, because again, it's all about, I feel like a big theme of the book is, you know, your students better than anybody. So you know what their needs are. And our book is very much like a grab and go type of build your own unit type of format, where, okay, knowing your students and knowing your goals, here are some different ways. Personally, I like to start just in the thick of the true narrative, which is actually our last chapter, of just sharing a story, because I think, like, if you can just build those storytelling skills at the beginning of the year, then whenever we ask you to then incorporate it into an informative narrative. So now I'm asking you to use some of those narrative skills, but also try to teach a lesson. I feel like that's one way to build it. I do think that building upon analysis kind of helps with the persuasion a little bit, because our persuasion chapter is really where you're incorporating a lot of those research skills. So you're kind of doing that analysis of what the source says and what I'm going to use it for to try to make my own point. So I do think that logically, for me, it makes sense to begin with just the true narrative, and then go into the informative narrative, and then build into the analytical, and then end with the persuasion, just because again, that one has the research in it. But I would respect a teacher doing a different sequence as well.
That are really good at those analytical skills, and so we can kind of jump ahead to those. And some that are really kind of lacking in the narrative skills, and so we need to kind of pull that in more often. It's just really dependent on your students and what they need to practice.
Yeah. Are there, or I guess the question is, I know a lot of this, as you describe it, the instruction take place within the structure of a writer's workshop. Can you, Kourtney, just at a high level, kind of describe what that might look like, how you would set that up?
Yeah, so a writer's workshop is a one in which the students are kind of in charge of their writing process. And so you give them the chance to be at whatever stage of the writing process they need to be at for that moment, and you are working with them a little more individually to help them through that process. So a typical day would look like students just working on whatever they have, working, some maybe at the very beginning in the brainstorming stages, some maybe drafting, some may be working on revisions, but they're each working on the same type of project. It's just you're letting those students lead their own process rather than doing it all together as a class.
What does like feedback and assessment look like? Who's involved? Is there student discussion, student dialogue, feedback? What kind of feedback is the teacher providing? How are you assessing the work? I mean, these might be multiple different questions, but there's I'm sure different things to tackle. Paige, can you start us
Yeah,
off with that?
I'll speak to that. I will say before I start that this is not a book about writing workshop. There
Mhm.
are tons of really awesome books about writing workshop if you really want to dive in there. But what it looks like in my classroom is I try to check in with each student at least once during the writing process. And that's only because I have so many students. If I had fewer, I would, in an ideal world, I'd be able to check in with everybody every single day. But I just kind of try to make a point to at least check in with everybody once. That way they're getting feedback during the process rather than after. I try not to leave as much commentary at the end just because I'm sure pretty much everyone can relate to that feeling of like, okay, I'm done with the paper and I'll read the teacher's comments, but I really just care about the grade at the end. And so writer's workshop is kind of trying to push against that idea and giving the feedback during rather than at the end of the process. In terms of assessment, like I'm looking for, do I see progress from when I checked in with you to the end? Not necessarily do you meet the bar of where I want you to be, of where everybody else in the class is very individualized in that I see that this person didn't have these three skills at the beginning. And then through an individual conference, I talked with them and I gave them the ideas of trying these skills. And then their final draft does have those skills. So that's more what I'm looking for. And again, that gets into a lot of conversations about assessment, which is not really what our book is about. But I think it's just that idea of being open to just seeing, again, letting everybody have their individual process, but also respecting that each student is at a different spot and not expecting them to have the same endpoint.
Yeah, imagine there's some dialogue from the start. You're getting students to be comfortable diving further into this type of writing expression and considering the types of personal narratives, and also kind of knowing what to expect and hopefully what to seek out as far as feedback and how to improve their writing and what are the key skills they're developing within the context of that. But I'm sure those conversations and that process of exploration might look a little different student to student, as much as the teacher can accommodate, hopefully, but to be able to support that development of their own story, their own voice. Kourtney?
Yeah, I actually try to encourage the students to do a lot of peer reviews throughout the process. And I'm working with them individually as well, but I like them to hear from their peers because a lot of times their peers are pointing out things that I may notice, but they're a little more welcoming to hear it from a peer sometimes than they are from me. Or maybe when their friend says it, oh, that finally clicks. And so I try to incorporate a lot of peer work during that process as well.
And they're getting more feedback that way too, because clearly there's only one of us, but I have sometimes I have 150 students in a day. So it's it's not
Right.
easy to provide constant feedback.
Right. How do you guide students on how to provide feedback to one another?
So we do it in other methods, like whenever we're doing class discussions while we're reading a text or whatever, I will walk around and kind of help them talk about we talk about how to talk to our peers. How do we help them with things? How do we guide them to something rather than just telling them the right answer or telling them this is how you need to do it? How do we give them suggestions rather than saying that they're wrong, kind of thing? And we practice those kind of conversations in other aspects of the classroom when we're not necessarily doing writing workshops.
Paige, do you have anything to add on that point?
I love and we reference this in the book. I love I noticed, I wondered, I heard sentence stems as a way of providing feedback, because a lot of times when we ask students to provide feedback on writing, like Kourtney said, it requires a lot of practice, because they always just want to either just say good job, or they'll point out grammatical errors and that's it. And so you really have to make that distinction of, okay, this isn't what I'm asking you to. There's a difference between editing and revising. And so we talk about that. And then whenever we talk about helping another student revise, whenever you use the sentence stem, I notice it's kind of like a mirror reflecting to the writer back to them what they're saying. Like, I noticed that you are saying this. And then whenever you read that comment, you can kind of judge, like, is that really what I wanted to convey? And
Mhm.
so using peer feedback sort of as a guide rather than just an editing tool is something that I really try to emphasize.
Yeah. Yeah, and some of this may have been indicated in the conversation, but I think it's not necessarily obvious, so it's worth a little bit of conversation, which is like how to approach writing instruction in a scientific way, and what that means and what that looks like and what that would be for an educator to think about how that approach plays into this. Kourtney?
I mean, I think about it in a scientific way in that I start first with what are my students struggling with? And if when I know this is what they're struggling with, this is where I want them to end up, then I'm thinking about, okay, what steps do I need to take to get to that end product? And so incorporating the skills a little by little until I feel like they're able to do those on their own. But it takes a lot of kind of that backward planning to get to that point.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, Kourtney and Paige, it's been great to have you here on the show. And before we wrap up the conversation, wanted to hear from each of you what to you is if you can narrow it down to one, or maybe you can have two, but the best thing about teaching students to write personal narratives, what you enjoy most, what it brings to your classrooms. I'll let Paige start on this, and then Kourtney, you can add yours.
I think for me, it's just a window of an opportunity to get to know my students better, which I think helps me serve them better as their teacher. If I know what's going on in their lives or what's important to them, then that helps me build that relationship that is so crucial. No matter what I'm teaching, there has to be that level of trust and understanding and mutual respect. And getting to know them through their writing is a way for me to get one step closer to figuring out who they are.
I mean, I would absolutely agree with that. But one of the things that I love about allowing students to incorporate their own voice is the level of engagement that students have. It's a lot harder to have them write an essay about something they don't care about. But whenever you take a topic that, one, they've chosen the topic, and then two, they get to talk using their own words, their own voice, they're incorporating their own stories into it. That level of engagement is just unparalleled.
Yeah, I mean, certainly speak from the perspective of how students can continue to use writing throughout their lives, that for many of us, right, figuring out the right way to incorporate our personal perspective and personal thoughts and personal story can be challenging, but yet once you kind of figure that out, it certainly is more impactful on audiences when you can demonstrate that relevance, and why is this person writing about this? And when you can show how you connect to it personally, it tells a reader, okay, now I can see where this is coming from. And
right, there's that
you know,
level of relatability with whenever a writer is vulnerable, then you feel like you can connect with that person more.
yeah, I mean, it has personal credibility in the sense of, certainly there's certain things that if you're just known for it or associated with a certain expertise, that might demonstrate the credibility. But if I can speak from my own perspective, at least it has that, and then it can translate into other types of communication. We're on a podcast here. A lot of this is the foundation is writing skills and how to communicate in various ways, but then students may learn to do that differently. But it's a great place for them to start. And if you're out there and you're interested in doing more of this in your school, the book is called Their Stories, Their Voices. You can find it from Solution Tree or wherever you get your books. You also, please do subscribe to The Authority if you're not already, for more author interviews like this. We will have a variety of episodes this month and probably in the coming months as well about literacy in all its various angles. You can find them here on the show. We also will have them on our other shows across the network. If you visit bpodcast.network, you can find more of them if you're particularly interested in that. And you can also visit our partner, Reading is Fundamental, at rif.org. You can subscribe to their newsletter there. You can find a bunch of resources that they have. If you are a teacher who is working on writing and reading and literacy, if you're a parent that's working on it with your own kids or otherwise interested, there's a lot there to check out. So we'll put all those links below. We'll also link to our guest social media and where you can find the book. So make it really easy for you. Check all of that out. Thanks for being here. And Paige and Kourtney, thanks for being on the show.
Thank you.